is an undertaking that was proposed to me by John. He wanted great controversies in science. And I renamed it, as you'll see on the handout. This is not great controversies in science. This is quarrels in science. This is quarrels because, or the other thing he was talking about was great rivalries in science. Newton didn't really have any rivals. That's one of the things. He didn't think so, and neither did most of the contemporary world. He did have some quarrels with people about priority. Who discovered what first? And some of these became very intense and actually rather mean-spirited. Newton was, as I'm suggesting here, profoundly neurotic, secretive, suspicious, solitary, and intensely averse to arguing about his results. He did not publish because he did not want to have to waste time arguing with people who didn't really understand what he had to say.
Sounds like an ordinary guy to me.
And John Maynard Keynes, that's the economist, that's the Keynesian economics, became fascinated with Newton and gathered a lot of Newton's papers, which were sort of being distributed around the world. Keynes sort of recaptured them and brought large bodies of them to Cambridge University, where for, I don't know, 36 years, Newton was a professor. Well, actually, he was an undergraduate, and then he was a graduate, and then he was a professor. 36 years there. And Keynes said, you know, when you look at the papers of Newton, which were vast, and we have all kinds of them still, when you look at them, you find out that he spent an enormous amount of his time on alchemy, on really almost the mystical chemistry that had come out of the Middle Ages. He was deeply interested in that. There's over 1 million words of manuscript in his papers devoted to alchemy. So, says Keynes, Newton is not the first creator of rational thought, sort of rational science. He's really the last of the magicians. And some of the very important science that he does is kind of magical. But I'm not going to really go there because we're talking about some issues with various people. And Newton and Hooke were contemporaries. And Hooke, this is not a real, this is a made-up picture of Hooke. There are no surely identified images of Hooke. Some people say it's because Newton got rid of them all when he became head of the Royal Society. but I'm not sure that's true. It makes a nice story. But Hooke was kind of a nasty guy. I mean, he was brilliant. He was irascible. He was proud. He boasted. He was deeply grasping for recognition. And he didn't, in the end, get much. But he did some very famous things, and I'll go over some of those. So this picture is made up by somebody who read some oral descriptions of Hooke, and from those oral descriptions tried to create this. The oral descriptions, actually the picture comes out nicer than the oral description, because Hooke was a small man, he had very sharp features, very pale, kind of buggy eyes, and a very badly curved spine, so that he always went around with a hunch. Got worse as he got older. And but you see on the table here in front of him several items that point to the aspects of Hooke that probably, at least one of which you know. You see right here is a spring, the coil spring. And that's the Hooke's law spring. Hooke's law says that if you stretch a spring, if you double the force, you double the stretch of the spring. There's also, down here, a pocket watch, because he was a very clever experimentalist and very good with his hands. He designed new escapements that made possible a pocket watch that you could actually carry inside your pocket instead of having to hang it off your belt. This conchoid here, this sea animal, represents the fact that his most important work was a volume called Micrographia, because part of his capability as an individual was that he was able to build a very, for the time, good microscope, 50x. And with that microscope, he really was discovering a new world. This is the 17th century. It's a time when there are big changes occurring in science, and in politics, and in society. And Hooke's Micrographia is quite a wonderful book. You can look at it. It's in Gutenberg online. You can actually bring it up and look at it. And the thing that's in it that's most wonderful are the pictures, the diagrams. And down here, along the bottom, is a map of London, because probably one of the greatest aspects of Hooke's undertakings through his life was his participation in the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire. The Great Fire which destroyed 14,000 homes and 87 churches. And Hooke was an associate, really, of Christopher Wren, who you may have heard the name because he is the designer and rebuilder of St. Paul's Cathedral. If you go to London and go to St. Paul's Cathedral these days, you will see this glorious structure. Hooke actually did some of the engineering for the scaffolding that made it possible to build the dome on the St. Paul's Cathedral. And then the third participant here is Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz. He's a very different character. Both Hooke was unusual in his nastiness. Newton could be pretty nasty. Leibniz was kind of a nice guy. He was a man of affairs. He was a diplomat. He was counselor to the Elector Duke of Lüneburg and Brunswick, which means Hanover, we would say today. In other words, he was associated with the House of Hanover. That turns out to have some interesting consequences because the Duke of Hanover becomes the King of England. And I'll just allude to that in a second because it's kind of interesting. Anyway, the point I would make is that all three of these men live in very turbulent revolutionary times. Revolutionary times. You know, people talk about the scientific revolution. But in Newton's lifetime, in England, there were really three revolutions, political revolutions. The first one is Newton is born in 1642. The Puritans in the Civil War triumph and execute the king, Charles I, who was king as Newton is born, but within a few years is executed by, among others, Oliver Cromwell, whose army has triumphed over the Royalist army and driven Charles from, removed him from the throne. Driven is not quite the right word, but you chop your head off. And Cromwell becomes in 1652, he becomes Lord Protector. That's a nice dictatorial sound, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Well, he was. And he divides the country into 12 districts. He appoints a major to be in charge of really the morals and ethics of each of these districts. They close all the theaters. They forbid dancing. They start closing alehouses. Intensely unpopular. So not surprising that when he dies of natural causes, there is a counter-revolution, one of the three. And there's the Restoration. A parliament brings back the son of Charles I, and we have King Charles II. And King Charles II rules, he's important to Newton and all these guys because he, among other things, charters the Royal Society of London for improving natural knowledge. He dies of natural causes, probably enhanced by excesses of almost any kind you can think of. And he's succeeded by his brother, who is James II of England and James VI of Scotland. And James makes some very serious mistakes. And one of them is that James decides he would really like to reestablish the Catholic religion in England, which is Protestant, and engenders very serious resistance to the point where 7 very important people go to William, the Stadtholder of Orange, a Dutch ruler of one of the Dutch states, and his wife Mary. Actually, it's Mary who is a steward, as all these kings are. Mary is the daughter of Charles II. But she's been raised as a Protestant, and so she's acceptable in England. She married her cousin, and he's also a Protestant. And so you have William and Mary, and they come over in what is called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And it's kind of nice. It's called the Peaceful Revolution. William arrives with 423 ships and 14,000 soldiers in this peaceful revolution. Mary dies, and a few years later William dies, and Mary's sister Anne, still a steward, becomes Queen Anne. That's the furniture Queen Anne. That's the Annapolis, Maryland Queen Anne. And she dies of natural causes. And who's going to be king? Well, because it has now to be a Protestant. Parliament has legislated that there will be no Catholics on the throne of England. That law is still in force. And they have to kind of dig down through the descendants, and they find George, Duke, Elector of Hanover, German, does not even speak English. He is made by Parliament, he is made king of England, and comes over as George I. George, what are we? We are George III is our George, who we didn't like all that much. But that's where the Hanoverians come in. So, turbulent times, a lot of things going on. And in fact, every one of these things has some implication. I just thought you'd like to see the Glorious Revolution with its peaceful 14,000 soldiers and 463 ships, as depicted by someone later. And in fact, 14,000 soldiers was not enough to take the throne away from James, because James had a much bigger army and sent that army out under Churchill, ancestor of our Winston Churchill, the Churchill who later became Duke of Marlborough. And Churchill met William coming in and took the whole army over to his side. So it was really a military coup that removed James and replaced him by William and Mary. All this is going on. This is 1688. Newton is well established by that time. But anyway, I just thought you'd like to get a sense of the turbulence of the time. This is also the time, 1665 to 1667, the last major plague comes and strikes England, and London kills more than 100,000 people, 25% of the population. You notice this guy is smoking a pipe, that guy is smoking a pipe. There was some thought that somehow the tobacco smoke would protect you from the plague. And in fact, there were people who were immune to it, and so they were the ones who got to go around and pick up all the dead bodies out of the streets, because people were dying in the streets, and take them off and bury them in great pits, because so many people had left London to get away from the plague. There was not really enough people there to dispose of the other people who were dying. Not only that, you have the Great Fire of London in 1666. That destroys over 13,000 homes, as I mentioned. And it's very important for Hooke. As I said before, Hooke has a major role to play in the rebuilding of London after that. So all this stuff is going on. But if you really want to get a synoptic picture of what's going on, I would suggest you read Neil Stephenson's Baroque Cycle. Those of you who like science fiction will know Neil Stephenson as Cryptonomicon and Snow Crash, the Diamond something or other. Anyway, You'll also know that he writes very big books. I thought if you want to get this, he has this kind of fictionalized account of the era. I mean, he goes always vast. And you see 960 pages, 815 pages, 892 pages. That's Neil Stephenson, all right. And this is unusual in that it's not sci-fi. I mean, it's fictional, and he's got a kind of subplot with a lot of things that are going on that are not historically correct. But his account of what Newton is doing and what Leibniz is doing, and I'm not sure Hooke is in there, is very good. I mean, it gives you a sense that, wow, how could he be doing all these things? And so I recommend that to you. I've actually read it. Now, so Newton is coming on this scene. He's born on Christmas Day, 1642. You can argue about whether that's really true because that's old-style calendar, and if you change the dates, it comes out a little differently. Everybody likes 1642 because that's the same year that Galileo died, and so you get the kind of mystical thing, oh, well, that, whatever it was that made Galileo so smart just moved on into Newton. I kind of like that, but seriously. But what I wanted to make a point is that Newton is born in 1642, Hooke a few years earlier, Leibniz a few years later. They are coming into a world in which a major transformation is going on in mathematics as well as in science. And the mathematics probably is done by a Frenchman, René Descartes, and by another Frenchman, Fermat, and another Frenchman, Pascal. These are the major players. Probably Fermat is the better mathematician, but here's a lesson for us. René Descartes actually writes down what he's done and gets it published. This is not an easy thing to do back in those days. The whole mechanism of scientific publication does not exist. There's no reasonable way to do it. It's done by letters between individuals. There'd be a couple of individuals who really became vacuum cleaners for anything, any news about mathematics from several different people, and they would then write other people and say, oh, look what Fermat has done, or look what Descartes has done. Because you know what Descartes...
when Gutenberg was?
Hmm?
When was Gutenberg?
Oh, Gutenberg is 15th century, 1446. That's when printing comes in. This is 200 years later.
So printing was available?
Oh, printing was available. It was very highly regulated. You had often to get, you know, government approval to write anything, to publish anything. The print houses were closely monitored in England, and but the sort of the culture of publication did not exist. You sent letters off to people. Not only did you send off letters to people, you sent them off with only partial information because you wanted people to see how smart you were. And so you'd say, oh, I found out a good one, and then you would write out an anagram of what you had done, and the anagram would go out, and you'd say, if you can figure out what this anagram really means, then you will see what I've done. And in the meantime, eat your heart out. You know? So, but Descartes wrote a 40-page book. You can get it on the internet. Gutenberg, our Gutenberg, has reproduced it. He wrote in French, which was anomalous. And also limited his readership. He should have written it in Latin, because Latin was still the lingua franca of the time of science. However, he was in Holland. He spent most of his life in Holland, because in this century, Holland is going through its golden age. It is a place with much more freedom, and there's a lot of money. And you'll notice there's a kind of association between people who are doing science and intellectual things and other people who have money. One tends to find the other. And indeed, the whole issue of patronage, which I'm not going to talk about, is very important to all three of these men. So if you want to ask me about that later, pretty good question. So anyway, La Géométrie comes out in 1637, and in Holland, where a man named Van Schoten does a translation into Latin. He also gets people to comment on it. He gets additional mathematical pieces of well, I guess I want to say, additional advances in mathematics are attached to this book as appendices. as associated chapters. So the result is the 40 pages becomes 800 pages. And I'm telling you this partly because we know that Newton read this book. So Newton comes to Cambridge as an undergraduate. He's what they call a sizar, which means he has to work his way through Cambridge. He has to be a servant, really, to somebody that was there of higher quality and of more money. He has to do that for a couple of years. It's not actually that burdensome. It's not clear that he suffered from it. And after 2 years, he becomes a scholar, which means he gets a stipend, and so he doesn't have to be a servant anymore. Anyway, we can see in Newton's records, of which he kept very careful account, when he buys a copy of this book. And it's about 1663. So Newton's about 21 years old. He's been 3 years at Cambridge, and he gets his book. That's the first time he shows any awareness of mathematics, let alone interest. He's gone through kind of standard British, that's not even standard schooling, but he goes to a kind of local school, and then there is some recognition at home that this is an unusual boy who can, and so he's encouraged to go through a regular school and then to go to Cambridge. How he gets to Cambridge, we're not quite sure. That is because, again, he needs a patron. And we're not sure who his patron was that got him to Cambridge. But he got there. And after 2 years, he became a scholar, and he took up mathematics. About the time he came to Cambridge, well, 1660, actually 1656, Cambridge establishes its first professorship of mathematics. There has never been such a thing. The standard curriculum of a university was the quadrivium, which was medieval. The standard material was Aristotelian philosophy and physics, you know, earth, air, fire, water kind of thing. That's actually changed a little bit, but not much. And so Newton is going through a school where sort of the curriculum is in disrepair. Nobody quite believes it anymore. There are a lot of rules about how you should teach it, and nobody's obeying the rules. The professors who are supposed to be teaching are spending many months away. Not unlike, well, never mind. So we see Newton go to a lecture by this man who was the first professor of mathematics. His name is Isaac Barrow, and he is holding the Lucasian chair of physics, a chair established by a man named Hooke. Anyway, so he gets his first dose of mathematics in 21, and then we have extensive papers of what Newton is looking at. We have his notes, we have his diagrams, we have his commentary on the things he's reading. All this stuff was saved. And we can go through it, and we can see that he starts sort of as ignorant of all mathematics. He must know arithmetic, but he's ignorant of all mathematics. Within about 8-9 months, he's producing original mathematics of his own. It's quite an astonishing transformation.
Charlie, before you go off, there's a line that says Descartes turns geometry into algebra.
Well, I should say that. I'm glad you brought my attention back to my talk.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wanted you to know this. You know how to convert geometry into algebra. You draw a pair of axes. You label them x and y.
Right.
You take y equals x squared. You plot y versus x, and lo and behold, it's a parabola. That's because Descartes was the first person to realize you could do something like that. Interestingly enough, he didn't use right angles. He was working on some Greek problems where he had several different fixed lines that were at weird angles. The thing we call Cartesian coordinates today was only invented in the next generation. People understood that he had done something really important, because suddenly you converted circles and lines, which are the elements of Greek mathematics, into equations, and which is algebra. He was also doing this because he was trying to solve two Greek problems, classic Greek problems. One is, how do you find the tangent to a curve? Now, the most complicated curves the Greeks ever dealt with were the conic sections, the parabola, the hyperbola, and the ellipse. And he figured out a way to use algebra to find, you give me a point on the parabola, he could find the tangent, the equation of the tangent line to that. That was always a big problem for people, find the tangents. The other problem is something called quadratures. And this is kind of a terminological thing. It just means the area under the curve. So that was the other thing the Greeks would like to know in their mathematics is, you have a curve, what's the area under it? They only had 3 or 4 curves, but they could do this in a kind of geometric way. With algebra, it becomes much simpler. And in fact, I'll show you a little bit of what he did. Descartes' method for finding a tangent to a given point on a curve, and the curve here is y squared equals x, and I think, can you see here? Yeah. That's it. Yeah, there we go. So there is the curve running. It starts at A, E, and it runs up in an arc there, CQ. So his method was find a circle that just kisses the point that you want to know the tangent to. And so he would put a circle up, and then he says, find the radius of that circle that connects to the point of contact. And he had an algebraic method to do that. That gives you the normal to, the perpendicular to the curve at that point. Once you know the normal to that point, he knew how, and in fact, you can show in about a minute, how to convert the normal into a line perpendicular to it, which is the tangent. That's his method. He also knew that the quadrature of this curve was known to be, if the curve was y squared equals x, the quadrature was known to be 1/3 y cubed. Now I'm showing you this partly because in this room, if you don't know calculus today, you knew it once, you know, I would look at that and I would say, oh, sure, he's just integrated the thing. The integral of y squared is y cubed over 3. That's not a very deep discovery. And furthermore, he's gone through all this work to find a tangent. I know how to find a tangent. You take the derivative of this thing. You take dy equals dx, and the tangent is probably in this case dx over dy. But anyway, nobody knew that. Nobody knew anything about differentiation. Nobody knew anything about integration. They just knew some of these things. But my point is that it's in the air. It is not that Leibniz suddenly had this, magnificent sudden recognition. It's not that Newton did the same thing. I mean, he had plenty of significant recognition. What's the word I want? I'll think of it after a while. Anyway, he has these moments of epiphany. That's the word I want. He had plenty of epiphanies, and this would have been one when he discovers, as Leibniz discovers, that in fact the two things are related. That the tangent and finding the area, those are inverse properties, inverse procedures. And when you write them down as inverse procedures, you have invented calculus. That is, in fact, the fundamental theorem of calculus. We put this dignified term on it. Anyway, so this stuff is all in the air. This has all happened a generation before. The algebraicization of geometry and looking at ways to find tangents and quadrants.
Is it so just two-dimensional? Or did the tradesman, for example, do three-dimensional a different way? I mean, the equations here look like they're...
Well, I'm showing you two dimensions. Yeah. In fact, that would be something that would be being worked out at the time because the Greeks could do a little three-dimensional stuff, but not much. Now with the algebra, you can go there in a big way. And so that's all unfolding. You said tradesmen?
Well, they have rules of thought that, to build stuff, right? They gotta get it right, otherwise the place falls down.
But they were not.
Yeah, no, they didn't do it through equations, they had methods, right?
Right. But this is now going to provide a theoretical basis for them in the way they have it. Now, I was mentioning about publication, and so I'm going to turn a little bit of my attention to Hooke. And publication was a problem for all of these guys. Newton's problem was that he didn't want to. Hooke's problem was that there wasn't anywhere to do it. And a key institutional development is the creation of the Royal Society, kind of a club of gentlemen who are deeply interested in science. They're very consciously saying that science has got to stop being kind of philosophical meanderings without any experimental basis. They're very explicit that we want to talk about science in a different way than it has been talked about. You'll heard the name of Bacon as somebody who proposed this early on, previous generation. So these are guys who have enough money so they can actually sit around and think about things. And they meet in coffee shops, another great institution of the 17th century, and probably important to the development of the Royal Society, is that there are kind of coffee shop clashes to talk about these things. Well, the creation of the Royal Society with its charter 1663 leads to a body that becomes itself kind of a patron. And so Robert Hooke, fellow of the Royal Society, with his microscope that I spoke of earlier, produces this very large book, which is has a big impact. We know that Newton read this book closely. And it's not just about pictures of things that you haven't seen before. It is here, you see, this is Hooke talking about this idea that I just presented to you, that science has got to stop being a work of brain and fancy and should return to the plainness and soundness of observations on material and obvious things. He wants you to look at the world, and not just sit there in your ivory tower and talk about it. It's a kind of, we take that for granted, but it was not. It was a new and revolutionary idea that was gathering great force in the 17th century. Now, so there is the creation of the Royal Society. The slogan, the motto of this is Nullius in Verba, which is essentially, don't take anything for granted. You know, don't just do it in words, but go look and see what's going on. So this is the motto of the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge. They have a secretary who has quite a famous role to play in a lot of the controversies, a lot of the arguments that are going on, because he becomes sort of the principal source of publication associated with the Royal Society. There's two kinds of publication. There's the book, the Micrographia. That's a big deal, and somebody has to bankroll it, and that comes out of patrons of the Royal Society. But there's also the kind of day-to-day shifting of information around Europe. Oldenburg was a German. He was the tutor of Robert Boyle's nephew. Robert Boyle is the Boyle of Boyle's Law. Robert Boyle was an ardent advocate of this approach to science. He was an extremely wealthy man. He made his studies of the properties of gases. You've heard of Boyle's Law. That's a gas law that he is based on the measurements that he made. And he was one of the major proponents of creating a society, the Royal Society. So he's right there. Also, in order to do his gas experiments, he needed a working vacuum pump. This is a new idea. And there people had built pumps and they were just terrible. They leaked, you couldn't pump anything with them. So Boyle hired a very able experimentalist to build him a better pump. That experimentalist was Robert Hooke. Hooke builds the first really successful vacuum pump, and Boyle proceeds to do good science with it, and somewhat anomalously, he gives actual credit to Hooke for building it. And it's explicit credit to Hooke. It was not usual for the rich man high up in the class structure of Britain to hand out credits to people who were doing the actual work down below.
There was a TV show that came from a book called Connections,
Oh yeah.
maybe 30 years ago. And what it did is took some invention and then worked backwards through time to where it came from, which is some of the kind of things that you're describing.
Right.
It's a wonderful book if anybody wants to read it.
It's a great TV series. Anyway, so when they form the Royal Society, they make Oldenburg the secretary. And it's not simply giving a job to the tutor of your nephew. It's Oldenburg spoke 5 languages quite fluently, and he had a vast correspondence with the learned men all across Europe, in Italy, and, Austria, and Germany, and the German states, and so on. And so he was good, and he would gather this stuff together, and he would write it up in something which became a journal which exists to this day, Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. He was, if you look at the early volumes, which is perhaps over-dignifying what they were probably largely written by Oldenburg. But Oldenburg, would be able to get some stuff out of Newton. I mean, he knew Newton was good, and he would try to get some of Newton's mathematics. And then he would tell somebody else what the mathematics were. So when Leibniz, who came to visit England around 1672, comes to the Royal Society, Leibniz does get some information about some of the things that Newton has been doing. He can't have gotten all that much because Newton didn't give all that much to Oldenburg. So, but still, he probably got some hints that helped him. And then Leibniz went home. So anyway, that's kind of the story there. And there's the shield of the Royal Society. And you see the Nullius in Verba, the motto along the bottom. Here, if you go into the Micrographia and look, you will see Hooke's drawings. He was a very capable draftsman. That's more than a draftsman, I think. He brought a beautiful picture of his microscope. And you can see here, this is the lens. Here, he's essentially using a very tiny piece of glass, spherical glass, and he gets about 50x with this thing, which is right at the top of the charts of the day. And he's got a lot of structure there for holding things and you need to put light on your sample. So here's the light. It's a flame with the lens and bringing the light down onto the object. These are things we do a little more easily these days. But he had to invent that thing. So this is the kind of thing he could invent. Now, I also wanted to show you that he was a thoughtful man. He was not just all hands, and that's why I gave you that statement about we have to stop just talking about things and go out and make measurements. And again, he looks through the microscope and he sees a new world. He is the coiner of the word cell, as we use it today for the cellular structure of things. Here he's looking at a piece of cork. Now he looks through his microscope. He's not taking pictures. There's no photography. He's drawing all this stuff freehand as he looks through it. And he's just extremely good. Here's a picture. That's a body louse. Apparently there were a lot of them around. It wasn't hard to find one. He probably could take it out of his own hair. But the one you know most is, of course, Hooke's law. And Hooke's law is illustrated here, where you see the spring. You hang a weight on the spring, and it goes 1 unit of extension. You hang twice the weight, and it goes to 2 units of extension. The amount of force and the amount of stretch are proportional to each other. Now, I mentioned earlier that you always wanted to show people how smart you were. So when he found his, what we call Hooke's law, he published it like this. That's his anagram. CEIIINOSSSTTUV. And of course, everybody here knows at once what that has to be, because like all of his contemporaries, they're very good in Latin. And it says, "Utensio sit vis," as the distortion, so the force. So that's his statement of that. Well,
How are those two related, by the way?
Anagrams.
well,
They're both in English.
Oh, I see. I get it.
You got it?
Yep.
Okay. all right.
One of the words is both alike.
Gotcha. Couple of spaces and rearrangements.
That's what an anagram is about. Okay. All right. So, I mean, and if you don't like that, I mean, here's the way you got it in your physics book. And then, if you went on and did some serious stuff, let me see, what do we got? You got it as a differential equation.
Right.
That, incidentally, is the Leibnizian notation for the differential equation. The Newtonian notation is that mx double dot equals minus kx. K is the constant of proportionality. X double dot means it's the second derivative with respect to time. There was no doubt in any serious mathematician's mind that Leibniz's notation was better. This looks okay when it's a second derivative. By the time you get to a third derivative and you got 3 dots, it's getting complicated. If you want a 4th derivative and a 5th derivative and a 6th derivative, you got a mess and you can't do it. So anyway, and there are other places where it is.
So is that law still accurate with new materials?
You can invent materials where it doesn't work, but it's hard. I'm not going to go into it, but a kind of basic lesson of introductory mechanics is that anything subjected to a small enough distortion, small enough stretching, is going to be linear. Okay? So, and that's wonderful because that gives you the harmonic oscillator, and we'll go, off we go. You know,
Right.
that would be more fun. All right. Now I just showed you another picture of the fire, just to remind you that Hooke was not only inventing Hooke's law and the word cell, and he was also massively involved. He was one of the four appointed surveyors to lay out new streets and new plots of land to verify ownership and to resolve tough issues of property rights, because people were arguing over the boundary lines. And Hooke said somewhere, because of his great tact in dealing with these people, was very welcome as a surveyor. This is completely contrary to everything else you'll ever hear about Hooke. Great tact was not his strength. Now, Hooke lived in Gresham College, which is where the Royal Society first met. Hooke was a very early member of the Royal Society, partly through the patronage of Boyle. Now, I said before that in 1663, Newton takes up mathematics. He reads von Schoten's edition of Descartes. In a few months, he's producing some new results. His first innovation is the binomial theorem, and at the risk of making you all go to sleep, I'm going to show you at least a little bit of that, what he did. So first, a binomial, right? Whoops. Touched on one. Oh,
Physics or computers anymore.
let's see, Microsoft is
Don't say.
Everybody needs a break. Let's see. Better way to do this.
If you had a mouse.
Yeah. Well,
It's just a review before the test.
right. Right. All right, there we go, fire. Ah,
Oh.
There's a Leibniz slide.
oh, it doesn't like that, does it? Yeah.
That's a bad problem.
Try just skipping the slide, Charlie.
Yeah, I don't actually need this now, but I gotta get back to it again.
You put it faster.
What's that?
Oh, don't. Yeah, practice, I'll get faster.
Well, just.
No,
Sorry,
go down,
sorry.
go down the
Do the
left
slide
side.
on the.
Yeah, click on the
to the right of the
slide.
letter.
Yeah, yeah.
Ah, right there, you got it.
That's me on the slide in Hawaii. It's anybody but me.
So Mary is saying that's her.
One more click and then you'll get.
Okay.
All right, we have it here.
Yeah.
This is the one I want. All right, so binomial means it has two terms. That's A plus B. A is one term, B is the other. You got two of them, bi. Binomial squared, not hard, you put a 2 there. Now, you expand it. And so A squared plus 2AB plus B squared is the expansion of binomial squared. A plus B cubed, A cubed, 3A squared, B, 3AB squared plus B cubed. A plus B fourth, and so on. Everybody by that time knew that there's a very simple relationship between the coefficients in the successors. That this coefficient is the sum of these two coefficients. This coefficient is the sum of these two. This coefficient is the sum of these two. This coefficient is the sum of these two. And this coefficient is the sum of these two. And you can do this forever. I mean, you want to know what A plus B to the 110th is? You got a lot of work because you got to go down through the whole thing. But you could. One of the things that Newton did was he said, oh, I see how this works, and I can write down an expression for the coefficient so that you don't have to go all the way down the line. And so he did. Now he'd say A plus B to the n, and you notice a couple of things. First of all, it starts out with A to the n, and then it's A to the n minus 1 plus b. The sum of the exponents of the A and the B always adds up to n, all the way through the sequence. And k is a number, is an index to tell you which of the terms you're looking at. If you start with 0, call that the 0th term, call that the k equal 1 term, call that the k equal 2 term, call that the k equal 3 term, all the way up to the kth term. And you see A to the n minus k, B to the k, they add up to n. That's supposed to happen. And then he says, this, if you work it out, is the coefficient of whatever that kth term is. So that's kind of useful. But what he really did, that's kind of mind-bending, is he showed that n could be a fraction. Did not have to be an integer. Could be a fraction. It causes the series to become infinite. You know, it's always in the expansion, you had a certain finite number of terms, as long as n was an integer. As soon as n is not an integer, it becomes an infinite series. This was not an infinite series was not a unique idea, special to Newton. They were pretty new in the day, and Newton came to it very quickly on his own and used them very effectively. So, there, I put a red box around it. That's the general coefficient. And I'm not going to dwell on this. I was just going to show you that if you want to take the square root of a 1 plus a very small number, x, suppose you want to take the square root of 1.05. Well, it's 1 plus a half 0.05. The square root of 1.05, to a very good approximation, is 1.025. Follows from this. If it's not good enough, you can go one more term. And if it's x 05, that would be a 20th. Well, x is 1/20th. X squared is 1/400th. You're getting small pretty fast. Newton got all that straight. He got a lot more things straight. And this is a collection of his mathematical papers. So he took up, as I said, he took up his mathematics. He was 21. all the stuff we've been talking about is in volume 1, which is labeled 1664 to 1666. His papers with his notes and his diagrams, plus a very extensive commentary by the editor, Whiteside. 8 volumes of his stuff. All the way up to 1697 to 1722, 5 years before he dies. And so it's all there and available to anybody. If you want to go down to Harvard to the physics reading room, it's all there on the shelf in the physics reading room. But it's a lot of stuff. But that isn't the only thing he did. And it's not the only thing he was doing while he was inventing mathematics and inventing Trigonometry and inventing calculus.
He published everything in Latin, didn't he?
No, that's a story too. First of all, he didn't publish much. He did publish the Principia Mathematica in Latin, but his other work, optics, his other great work, is in English. So, he's got, in his spare time while he's doing all his mathematics, he invents the reflecting telescope. Now he has a reason to do this, and I'll tell you that in a minute. But the telescope first shows up right around 1600. Galileo makes his own, looks at the stars, gets in all kinds of trouble with the church. Right. But that's a different story. They were lousy telescopes because we would say today, well, of course they were lousy telescopes. They didn't know about chromatic aberration. But if you have a single piece of glass for a lens on a refracting telescope, and you're bringing light in from one place, you're going to have a rainbow halo around the image points, because we say today, glass refracts the different colors of light differently. This is not an idea that anybody could conceive of back then, because they had this picture that light, they weren't quite sure what it was, but it did seem to be that light was white. And the only theories they had were that somehow the colors were made by the way, the angle of the light hitting your retina, or something like that. And but anyway, one way to get rid of chromatic aberration, if you know about it, is don't use a lens. Use a curved mirror, single surface mirror. So about 1671, he built one. This was his entry card. Not entirely welcome to him, but it was his entry card into the world of the Royal Society. He sent his telescope to London, and the Royal Society went bananas. So this is fantastic. Somebody really good has done something really wonderful here. What is going on? He then followed that up with what was probably his first published paper. Here's a picture of the actual telescope, which I think still exists. Being handled with white gloves. So it's very short, about 6 inches long, and it gives the same kind of resolution and image quality that a 6-foot retractor gave in those days. So it's quite a change. There's some bad things about it we don't go into here, because it turns out that they had no real good techniques for silvering the mirror, for coating the mirror. Everything they used, and he invented some of those things in his laboratory work, to coat the mirror. They tarnished very quickly. It went bad. So it didn't work as a telescope for very long. It didn't work as a good one. Hooke pointed this out in no uncertain terms, and Hooke tried urgently to find a better coating. I'm not sure that he actually got to the point of silvering the backside of glass, which of course works pretty well, because then that reflecting surface is protected from tarnish.
Wouldn't that also incur the diffraction though, as you're going through glass and back out?
You get a little, yeah, but it's not what you get when you send it through. And anyway, this was his telescope, and within a month or so, he was made a member of the Royal Society. in London. But partly out of appreciation for that, partly because Oldenburg was working him over, he sent in a paper on his much more profound discovery that, in fact, motivated the reflecting telescope, because he had done this famous experiment of bringing light in from the left there, where it says S, through a hole in the screen into a prism, and having the result, the light spreads out into colors. So I've shown you down here in the corner picture, light being spread out into colors. And he
Excuse me,
concludes,
why is there, from A to X, why is there a small slot? Is that only picking up certain parts of the colors?
I guess.
I don't know the answer to that, John, but you know, we do know later, people found out that there is radiation up here. I don't know if there's any radiation down there in the ultraviolet, because I think the ultraviolet is absorbed by glass, but infrared is actually there. But I don't know the answer to the question.
Because then you
And
have
the same thing
something-
at Y, John, too.
Yes, right.
No, that I do know the answer to, and that's much more important. That is, in fact, the point of the experiment. Because he's brought the light in, he's displayed it as a spectrum. Then
It's a
he
single color.
picks out a single color, runs it through the prism, and shows that it does not disperse into more colors. He is showing you that white light is a mixture of colors, and that the color property is singular to some particular. He doesn't have this idea of spectrum or wavelength or any of the concepts that I tend to fall into naturally. But he understands that if you've got blue light, it's blue, and nothing you're going to do to it with a piece of glass is going to stop it from being blue. Whereas if you've got white light, a piece of glass is going to make it into the spectrum of colors. It's going to break it up. So he understands that he's getting the dispersion from the prism. Yeah.
That first slot may have to do with the fact that if a prism isn't perfect, you're not going to get just one rainbow out of it. You're going to get multiple.
Huh. I like that as a reasonable
And they
hypothesis.
didn't make perfect.
But we have to do the experiment, actually. Can't just-
Today,
Nullius in verba. Okay.
Another session.
Yeah, right.
I know
All
that
right.
they did not make perfect.
All right, well, the next picture I'm going to show you is one that I've come back to very often. So anyway, he publishes this paper in the, I should say, he publishes this paper in the Philosophical Transactions. Basically, he writes a letter to Oldenburg, and Oldenburg puts it out to the world. And the world goes bananas, because this is a huge change in conceptual view. Nobody had thought that kind of light had these unique properties intrinsic to light. It also launches the beginning of the arguments between Hooke and Newton, because Hooke is kind of aggravated that this young guy who nobody's ever heard of before has suddenly showed up in the Royal Society. And so Hooke is trying to pick this apart in various ways. And Newton hates that. Not so much because he, I guess, fears the idea, but because so much of his time gets involved in it, and he wants using his time for other stuff. Well, anyway, I thought that I'd like to just say a word about this business of being able to change your concept. Well, Newton is changing a lot of concepts. The one on light is the most obvious. But here, this is this picture. This is a picture Thomas Kuhn in his Structure of Scientific Revolutions like to use. But I assume most of you have seen it at one point or another, because it's kind of a
I still can't see the old one.
Well, now that's an interesting thing.
The lower right.
But the point I want to make is, some of you see the young woman, some of you see the old hag.
I saw both.
You don't see them, but Dave, you don't see them
No, I see
both at once.
No, I can see.
That's the point I want to make, is that you can see one or you can see the other, and if you're good, you can go back and forth.
I agree.
And that's kind of what the problem is when you are doing a scientific revolution.
I see it.
You're looking at the same set of data that everybody else has looked at, and you're seeing something else.
Yeah,
Right.
the trick, if you want to call it that, is you have to stare at it for a long time. And the eyes, one eye begins to dominate another.
You think?
It's sort of part of a
Oh,
classic
John.
in neurology.
I see it now.
See the chin and the mouth?
Yeah, but it's the nose it's the nose that does it.
Yeah. All right. So
The
there's
chin turns into the nose.
On the other hand, you see the, you can go back and forth, right?
Yes, now I can.
All right, good.
It's good for the eye muscles.
That's actually good. So that in effect, you know, you can see Aristotle's physics or you can see Newton's physics, but you can't see them both at the same time. And you'll be looking at the same data. And that's the point I wanted to make here. The real point I want to make is that Newton had this incredible ability to change the perception, to see a different pattern in the same structure. That's in fact what leads him to his greatest work, which is published in Leibniz in 1687. Now, I want you to notice a couple things. 1687 is about 20 years after he's done the work. This is the publication problem again. That's his personal problem, and it's also the lack of means. But by 1687, people have kind of begun to understand how to get stuff out of Newton. And so Edmund Halley, who is an official now of the Royal Society, goes and spends a lot of time with Newton, persuades him to kind of bring together all this stuff. It is also the case that in 1684, 2 years before, Leibniz has published the results of his discoveries about calculus. And Newton is pissed, really, because he feels that Leibniz is trying to take away his claim to priority. And that, I think, gets Newton off his duff as far as publication goes, and that certainly encourages him. Because in the Principia, there's some of the mathematics that he did 20, 30 years ago. There are various parts about the problem. But in it, we're talking about great changes in perception. The Aristotelian idea of force is that somehow a force is embedded in an object, and that's what keeps it moving. Which is a little, you know, it sounds strange to me, but it didn't sound strange to anybody back then. What sounded strange to them was Newton's idea was that no, that's not that. There is some amount of motion, a quantity of motion associated with an object. It's a big object moving at a certain speed. It has more quantity of motion than a small object. I always liked quantity of motion better than momentum, but that's what it was. Yeah. And if you want to change the quantity of motion in a thing, an external force, a force from something outside comes in and changes it, sucks it out, adds it to it, something like that. That's F equals ma. That's you just had your first lesson in classical mechanics. But it's again this kind of perceptual change that you've essentially dumped Aristotelian view of what's going on.
Just a side issue. It says imprimatur there. They actually had to get permission to print my home.
Oh, there would be censors. That is the whole British, the English. Well, there was an office.
Of an office, but it had to be passed through that.
Yes.
And what were the criteria? Were the revolutionary printing?
I don't think this was considered a threat to the regime. but if you were a threat to the regime, you weren't going to get
just
published.
curious about it. Because
Yeah. I don't know the details enough.
Okay.
It could have been a threat to the church at the time. Church is
Church,
very
yeah.
prominent.
But of course, companies do that today. If you work for a big company and you want to give a presentation someplace,
If you work for
you
the
may
federal
have, you
government.
may have to take it through half a dozen people.
Oh, yeah, but it's the company property.
How was Newton paid during all this time?
Sorry?
How was Newton paid during all this time?
Well, that's a good question. It comes to the issue of patronage. Who was you thinking? Newton was paid because he was a professor at Cambridge. There was endowment at Cambridge. In a way, of the three people, Newton had the best deal. Once he was a professor, he got a certain amount of money per year. You know, the numbers sound kind of small to us, like £50. £80 a year. But in fact, that was actually considered pretty good money in those days. You could live well on it, right?
You must have tutored also, I would imagine.
I don't want to go there, but the answer is no.
No?
I mean, I believe there is evidence that he had, of course, he tutored one or two students altogether. The whole business of being a professor at Cambridge in around 1670 was bad. I mean, most of the professors just took their money and went away. Newton actually stayed there, did a little teaching, not much, but more than most professors. And one of the reasons we have his paper on optics is that as a professor, he taught some optics, and he was supposed to file his lectures there at Cambridge. And he did a couple. He didn't do anything like all of them. But those couple were probably the basis for the book that he's going to write later, because in 1704 he writes another book. This is Optics, or a Treatise on Reflection. Get it again, 1704. This is the work he was doing in 1671, 1672. So, you're not rushing into print. But the reason was, I think this is actually explicit somewhere in there, he was so irritated with Hooke and so wished to not have to talk to Hooke about anything that he just said, I'm not going to publish this. And then Hooke died in 1703, and the next year, he published this. Moreover, because he's now arguing with Leibniz, you see, it's Optics, or a treatise on blah, blah, reflections, refractions, inflections, and colors of light. Also, two treatises of the species and magnitude of curvilinear figures. That's his calculus. And the reasons he's putting it there is because he knows Leibniz has published his calculus, and he's trying to show the evidence that I had these ideas back in 1666. You didn't have your ideas until 1674, and then you stole them from me anyway. That was the essence of the argument. Well, I got to move this along. So here's the slide.
You could, or what you don't finish today, we can pick up another time.
All right.
So I wouldn't worry about speeding up.
Thank you, John. So this is
too interesting.
This is the rest of his life in 5 or 2 or 6 bullets. Again, I want you to remember that he wrote a number of religious tracts dealing with the literal interpretation of the Bible. He was very interested in this. He devoted a great deal of time to alchemy. There is a kind of story that he was messing around with mercury and it caused him to have a nervous breakdown, maybe neurological problems. We're not sure of that, actually. It turns out people like these stories because they have irony in them. He was a member of Parliament for some years. He was elected from Cambridge to be a member of Parliament. His most famous job, and I got the date wrong there, but I'll correct that, became perhaps the best known, Master of the Royal Mint in 1699. And he held that position until 1727. After 36 years at Cambridge, he packed up everything in a month and left Cambridge and moved to London, where he became first Warden of the Mint and then Master of the Mint. And he became Master of the Mint at a moment of great financial crisis in Britain because they had decided to issue a recoinage. In other words, they called in, this is a tough thing to do, they called in all the old coins, which were hand-stamped, and when you hand-stamp a coin, it's rather easy to clip a little piece off it, and people did. And so most of the coins in circulation had been clipped more than once and devalued, and somebody else took the little bits and made some money off that. They were also not that hard to counterfeit because it was a hand-stamped thing with a hand die. You could make your own and do that. And so right around 1696, the English government said, all the old coins are going to be declared invalid. You have until such and such a date to turn in your old coins, and then we're going to issue new coins, machine stamped, with a knurled edge around the side, so you can't clip them. That was what that's for. And just about that, after this is all kind of underway, and is in a kind of terrible mess at administrator way. That is, it's a big deal to do this, and they have several different places it's happening. The main mint is actually in the Tower of London, and it's not going well at all. And somehow Newton is appointed warden of the mint. That's a subsidiary job to a master, but it's expected that he's being appointed there as a sinecure. He's not supposed to actually do anything. He's supposed to draw a salary and go on being Newton. By this time, everybody knows that Newton is a fairly important, iconic person to have celebrating the English nation. And he takes the job very seriously. And indeed, he turns out to be a very good administrator. Partly because he immediately, as is always the case when he comes with a new problem, he wants to know all the details and how it works. And he goes into a kind of focused concentration on it so that he, almost uniquely among the various people involved, understands how the mint works and who's doing what and what the hang-ups are all around. And he turns the situation around within a few years, enough so that by 1699, he's kind of promoted from warden to master of the mint. And again, if you want to get some sense of what this can involve, you read the Neil Stevenson third volume, System of the World. But all while he's doing this, so he holds that job until his death in 1727. He is master of the mint. The mint works pretty well. Just incidentally, as you would expect, anytime there's this big change in the currency of the money system, all the rich people come out very well and the poor people are very screwed. Okay? Nothing has changed. But all the while, so by 1703, things have quieted down at the mint. I mean, he's been working immensely hard on it. And so now he has time to become president of the Royal Society. And in 1705, he becomes the first scientist ever to be knighted. The British know they got somebody pretty special. Now, just in passing, let's see. There is this Commercium Epistolicum of John Collins. It's published in 1722, but in fact, it has to do with the Leibniz controversy, and there are earlier versions of it that are a collection of the things that Newton told John Collins back around 1670, or later, of what he had done with calculus. And so this is being brought out as evidence of Newton's priority. It is, however, the fact that it's 17.2 is because it's a later edition. But it's being brought out because the controversy, the argument with Leibniz has gotten very hot and very nasty. And to the point where, without Leibniz even really knowing what was going on, the Royal Society sets up a special committee to review all the documents and to decide whether there was plagiarism or not. And it brings in a report which is absolutely devastating to Leibniz. Only later do we learn that the committee was in fact appointed by the president, Isaac Newton. So it was all his friends. And furthermore, he wrote the final report, which is published anonymously.
Very unbiased.
And you know, Leibniz kind of knew what was going on. So by this time, Leibniz, who was kind of an affable guy, he's going, and early on said, well, yeah, no, sure, you invented calculus before I did. I don't have any problem with that. But I also invented calculus. And this is my creative. The other thing that poisoned this whole interaction was he was a German, and the other two guys, and the Royal Society was not German. It was English, and so you get this nationalist aspect to it. And so basically, Leibniz gets screwed. He also had his flaws, but you know, he was, as I said before, he was actually a counselor, advisor, a diplomat for the family of the electors of Hanover. And by the time we're coming down towards the end of his life, well, he uses that position, always. I'm going traveling for the lecture. I'm going to go to Paris. I'm not going to spend 3 years in Paris. And most of the time I'm in Paris, I'm going to be talking with really smart guys about things that interest me. Oh yeah, and I will do some work for the Duke back home. And this finally, and he does some wonderful things. I mean, his mathematics is pretty good. He is probably the first person to use the binary number system. He uses matrices, and we would look at them now and say, oh, that's a matrix that you're using here. And he uses a kind of array of things to solve linear equations. And his calculus notation, undoubtedly superior, used widely throughout Europe. Indeed, there's a whole argument that because of Britain's adherence to the Newtonian fluxions and fluids, he called them, derivatives and integrals, we call them, because of Britain's adherence to that, they probably held their own mathematics back a century. And it wasn't until the beginning of the 19th century that some Brits said, oh, come on, it's just so much obviously better. We should use this. I put a later version of that on the back and one of the reading things. Gutenberg.
It was the first Brexit. It was the first Brexit.
Yeah, well, it didn't work out well for them then. We'll see how it works out this time. Anyway, I just tell you that he ends kind of badly because he's in Vienna. And the Duke is getting more and more fed up with this guy who won't ever come home to Hanover and just keeps wandering around doing stuff. And the Duke says, look, you come home. And he would write back and say, no, I'm doing this way. I got to stay in Vienna another 3 months, again, another 6 months. Finally, the Duke says, you come home. And so finally, he starts off from Vienna. Well, he gets home from Vienna to Hanover 3 days after the Duke has left to become the King of England. And the message is, don't come to England. You stay there in Hanover and finish the family history that you've been working on for 30 years. He doesn't. I mean, he stays in Hanover, but he does not ever finish that history. And in fact, he was, I don't want to take anything away from him, it's just kind of amusing. He does have a huge impact on philosophy, but I'm never the guy to get to appreciate philosophy, so but he does. And he's also branded as a man who starts many grand projects but finishes few. He has a calculating machine that he's building. Never gets finished. He never finished the history. He did try in several places, and in a few places succeeded in establishing scientific societies. So that was very. He yearned always through his life to bring together opposing ideas and people. He really wanted, for example, he tried very hard to formulate a description of religion that would enable the Protestants and the Catholics to at least be credible, and this was always kind of what he did. Anyway, he ends up essentially in disgrace in Hanover. Never gets to see. King George actually comes home to Hanover every once in a while. I don't think King George really liked being King George of England, but he comes home to Hanover, where these people speak his language. And he comes home, I think, the first time in 1716, and a few days after Leibniz has died. Leibniz never gets to be upgraded by him. Well, that's kind of the story I wanted to tell you. And but I thought I would try and end with a summary of my talk. Let's see if I can do this. That was a summary of my talk. And if you were alert, you could actually get the illusion.